welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. This is our second ever Lamplight Lunch, and we are trying to do these once a month to explore different topics as they intersect with our work at the Night Ministry. My name is Brittany, and I am the Congregational Engagement Manager, and we'll be continuing to put these together. So on one day, I'm actually going to send you a quick survey for feedback about this, and also to see if you all have any ideas for upcoming Lamplight lunches, because we really want to have this be an opportunity for folks to connect and figure out how all of our different work is intersecting in the world. So please fill that out today if you have a chance. But today we are really excited to be talking about advocacy. As some of you have heard, we're advocacy team here at the Night Ministry, and we're really wanting to dive in that. And today I am joined by my colleague Ted and by our friend Naya from the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. So I'm really glad that both of them can join us today. They are the advocacy experts, and I'm actually going to have both of them introduce themselves. So Naya, how about you introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naya Kelly. I'm the Director of State Legislative Policy, Equity, and Transformation over at the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I've been at the organization for the last 5 years. Aquarius, middle child.
Thanks. Only child, Scorpio. Ted.
Hey everyone, my name is Ted Peso. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Night Ministry's Director of Strategic Partnerships. I've been at the Night Ministry for just over 12 years, and I've had the pleasure of working with Naya closely through our work on the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless Youth Committee and everything associated with that. So they are wonderful partners, and I'm really happy they could join us here today.
Awesome, thanks to both of you. Ted, can you just start by telling us what is advocacy? We're just going to break it down to the foundations.
Yeah, definitely. So I think when people think of advocacy, they think of lobbying, right? They think of going to Congress, making deals behind closed doors to get your legislation passed. And while lobbying is part of advocacy, advocacy is so much more than lobbying. And so that's what I always try to communicate to people, that advocacy is really any action we take as either individuals or members of an institution that will make the case for a mission that we support or a cause that we are impacted by in some way or we're associated with. It really comes from the Latin word to call out for support. So that tells us when we advocate, we take action, we're public, we want to craft action that can change the position, procedures, or policies that the institutions we exist within place on us or on our society. I think advocacy is really strategic, but at its core, it's active, right? So it's speaking up to systems that are in power, defending an issue in a public space. It's about placing a problem or an issue that we see on somebody's agenda, providing a solution, and then kind of trying to rally the communities to support that solution that we put forward. I think in the time that I've been at the Night Ministry, the thing that I've learned the most is that advocacy really needs to be inclusive of everyone who's at the table. I think when I started, I was kind of under this impression that advocates bring a voice to the voiceless. We hear that a lot, right? And I think through the work that I've done and through the young people that I've met, you really realize that nobody is voiceless in our society, and our job as advocates is to include the voices of everyone and to really create a plan that is collaborative. So none of this happens by ourselves, right? It happens with partnerships like the one we have with CCH and some of our other partners.
Awesome, thank you, Ted. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Night Ministry does in terms of advocacy?
Yeah, definitely. So the Night Ministry has been involved with advocacy pretty much since we started. So when the Night Ministry started our work, the youth emergency shelter system did not exist, right? It was actually illegal to have shelters that could provide services to young people, minors, right? You could be charged with harboring a minor. And so our founding president and CEO, Tom Behrens, he actually was placed on a committee that Governor Thompson formed to create the youth emergency shelter system and to create a funding line for homeless youth programs in the state of Illinois. And so a lot of Tom's early work that he did with Governor Thompson and with other partners across the state to create that youth shelter system was kind of the basis of our advocacy. And then over time, we've really done a lot of work with young people to include them in advocacy work that we do. So young people, we take young people to Springfield with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. We take young people to Washington, D.C. with the National Network for Youth. We have young people whose voices are part of national youth boards in the U.S. Historically, the Night Ministry has provided training to congregations around advocacy and sort of the issues that we work within. And so that's something I know that our team at the Night Ministry, the team that Brittany and I sit on, is really working to get back to that and have more regular opportunities for congregations to receive training. And we're also opening that up to the public with our advocacy team, which many of you on the call today joined, including our board of directors, including our associate board and other supporters of the Night Ministry. Additionally, I would say that our advocacy at the Night Ministry has traditionally followed our government funding. And so we receive most of our government funding for our youth services. So historically, we have probably tackled more youth-based issues in our advocacy work. And I think we're trying to move away from that to include a broader range of topics that impact our clients, especially on our health outreach bus. So we'll be doing more health work in addition to the youth work that we've been doing.
Thanks, Ted. I always learn more every time you tell me about the advocacy work that we do. I ask Ted like 17 questions every day, so I'm always learning about the things that are happening here. Naya, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how we go about advocating with our elected officials.
Yeah, sure. Ted has really just laid an amazing foundation for me to just where I'm going to go with this. There are varying ways for you to reach out to your legislators, particularly when we're talking about on a local basis as well as like state and federal. I always say it starts with knowing who they are. And like a lot of folks just don't know who their alder person is, or they may not know who their House representative here in Illinois or their state senator. And like it's easier to know like, oh, Senator Durbin, Senator Duckworth, those are like my federal folks. But starting with going to just typing into Google, who is my legislator, and it will like bring you through a pathway where that it will tell you who the governor is, who like based on once you put in your address and all of those things, and help you provide that information to you. Next, like thinking about how do you reach out to them? Like we're obviously in the digital age, and so a lot of them have websites where you can and I know this for on the state basis for Senate and House Democratic members, they like all of their websites are pretty much the same. So they all have like this space where you can like type in message, or they also have their local office numbers. I always say I do a lot of relational meetings, and that's something that my CCH has taught me. We're an advocacy organization that not only does like lobbying, which is in my position, but also organizing, which is very much about building relationships. And so I'm not constantly going to legislators about what I need. I also ask them what they need from me, which is a crazy thing. Some folks might think that's a weird thing for them to ask of me, but do they need data on what homelessness looks like in their community? Do they need to know like with their local school? Like I've had legislators reach out to me and say, the school is attempting to do this to a student who's experiencing homelessness. What are the solutions that I could provide to them? And what kind of assistance can I provide besides bringing this child into my home, which legislators will do? And I'm like, amazing. But we have like federal laws that said that like that student is required to get things. And so it can be as simple as you like sending a postcard or sending an email or calling your legislator and say, I would just like 15 minutes of your time to talk to you. And I know that sounds strange, but I promise you, if you meet your legislator, the mystique and the curtain comes down and you're like, huh, you're in this position. That's interesting. So like they all like there are things that they don't know about their community, and you as a constituent have the right and should have the opportunity to meet with them, whether it's on a you need something or you want to introduce yourself. And for me, that's a strategic way of doing it. Is I want to meet you on a one-on-one basis before I actually need something from you, because when I need something, I want to be able to come back and you say you know who I am. There's also like, I don't know, I'll go a little bit further, but like in my work, it's bringing people down to Springfield to meet their legislators. Before we were in this hellscape of COVID, Ted mentioned like we would have lobby days. So bringing people down to Springfield, and it can be, you can do bus loads of people, or what we've been moving towards as an organization is bringing smaller groups who come down more regularly. So again, they get to know the state capitol. They get to know their legislator. Their legislator sees them and says, oh, I remember you from last time that you were here. And they're able to build, again, those relationships that are more sustainable than, okay, we brought 500 people down to the Capitol, and maybe they got to meet their legislator and maybe they didn't, but they knew that a whole bunch of folks from the Chicago Coalition were down in Springfield. But that is a way to also meet your legislators.
Thanks, Naya. That's really helpful. And I like how you talked about kind of the relationship building aspect. I think so often, at least for me, I think about advocacy and I think about it as kind of transactional, right? You're trying to have these transactions between you and the people in power. But I like how you kind of shifted that towards relationship building. That sounds really important.
Yeah, and as people are thinking about like if you are a part of groups, if you're a part of your church, or some sort of religious affiliation, like is it you all inviting the legislator to come to a service and to build community in that way, or like some sort of tea or coffee talk for them to also talk about what's important to them, and not in a bipartisan way, but like you represent our community and we want to invite you in because we are community.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to shift a little bit to talk about kind of issues that are coming up in the new year. Obviously, we have a new administration coming in at the federal level. Ted, can you talk to us a little bit about what's happening there?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on right now in Washington, D.C., I'm sure, as people understand. So we already know who's going to be leading, who's been nominated to lead HUD and the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. And so the great news about transitions is that there are career staff working in all of these departments that fund and create regulations for our programs. There are career staff who will stay on over time, right? So our sector has a lot of relationships with those career staff in the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Health and Human Services. So that will make the transition a little less burdensome than some people might expect. But there are things that we're going to want to do over the next several months to prioritize some of our issues. So first of all, we know that the current administration in Washington, D.C. has created a lot of harmful rules and proposals that impact individuals experiencing homelessness. I'm thinking especially of rules that impact the LGBTQ community, as well as mixed status families. So those are families where some members of the family are documented and some people are undocumented, right? There have been a number of federal rules, especially at Housing and Urban Development, that have kind of impacted the ability of those communities to access shelter and housing. So we're gonna wanna make sure that the new administration at HUD will freeze any rules that have been proposed but have not been finalized, and any rules that have been made over the last several years that impact those communities, especially, to be reviewed and reconsidered as needed. I think the second thing we need to work on is there's an overarching piece of legislation that governs runaway and homeless youth programs like the Night Ministry. It's called the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, or RIA. That is the program that allows us funding to serve minors. It also allows us funding to provide street outreach services for any young person experiencing homelessness. And it allows programs to provide transitional living programs for young people experiencing homelessness. In addition, it allows for funding to go to studies that impact the services we provide. So better understanding the number of young people experiencing homelessness in our country, and also the needs of those young people. We had a huge study several years ago that Chapin Hall led that was funded through this process. And as part of that legislation, there was supposed to be annual updates to that, and that really has not happened during the current administration. So we want to get back to that, but we also want to make sure that that funding is adequately funded, as well as the rules respond to the needs of the young people we're serving. So currently, we want to make sure that that funding has protections for LGBTQ young people, so that the providers who host services for this population understand how to respect that population, how to provide competent services. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, that most of the people who apply for those funds do not receive grant funding because there's just not enough funding. So we want to make sure that the funding level is adequate too. And then two just really big things. We know that the incoming administration is pledged to make Obamacare better. And so kind of tracking what that means for our population, we know that Obamacare led to a lot of opportunities for our young people to get coverage when previously they weren't able to get covered by Medicaid. But also it created really interesting partnerships with our health outreach team because of that availability of Medicaid to more people in Illinois. So we want to make sure that any changes to Obamacare preserve some of that and improve those services. And then finally, we've been tracking coronavirus stimulus packages to make sure that those packages serve our community well. The current proposal, for example, in DC does not include direct payments to homeless service agencies. So that could cause an issue for organizations that have seen increased spending as a result of the pandemic. And any organizations that may want to pay hazard pay to their staff during a stay-at-home order would probably not be able to do that without extra funding from the government. So that's important. Additionally, when stimulus payments are considered to the general public, one issue we saw in our programs at the start of with the first stimulus package that came through was that young people who were claimed as a dependent on their parents' income taxes were not able to claim that stimulus payment. And so that was a huge hiccup that we weren't able to assist some of our clients through. And so we want to make sure that in any stimulus package coming up, that those there's a solution there for that gap that we saw.
Thanks, Ted. I appreciate that. That's definitely a lot of new information for some of us. So for those of you that may be wondering, how to keep up with this stuff, joining our advocacy team will surely be helpful for that, so that you know what's happening as it's happening, because it's hard to keep track of all those things on your own. Thanks, Ted. Naya, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what's happening at the state level, particularly. I've been hearing a lot about funding, right? We have a funding shortfall in a lot of ways.
The state is broke, is basically underlined, bold, italicized. And to just conceptualize this, our state budget is about $48 billion. Around between 8 and 12 billion of that goes towards like things we have to pay for. Like there are court orders, there are contracts that require, and that's our pension liabilities as well as like Medicaid funding. for the 28 billion that's left, a lot of that goes towards human services, K through 12 education. So, children in school from preschool until they graduate high school, and then higher ed for students who go on to college. We care about all of those things. When I talk about the work that we do at CCH, it's not just centered on we may be a one issue organization, but the folks that we serve are not one issue people. So people who are experiencing homelessness need access to early education and early intervention for their children. They need access to SNAP, and which is what some folks may know as food stamps, cash benefits. They may need access to Medicaid and Medicare, and just different types of services. So when one pot is impacted, another pot is like, it impacts the services that someone may need over in another space. And knowing that the state is broke, we're about, I think we're at like $8.1 billion in the hole. And one of the things that would have assisted in getting us out of this hole would have been the progressive income tax. We know that across the state, we have a flat income tax. Someone who's making $30,000 a year is paying the same tax bracket, or paying the same percentage of their income as someone who is a billionaire. And we could not change that without a change to our state constitution, because it's embedded in our state constitution. So right now on the table is we probably need to raise the flat tax. So for the folks who voted against this progressive income tax, it means that the likelihood that all of our taxes will now be going up in the state in order for us to start paying off some of those back bills, as well as making sure that we're able to continue providing services to folks. The governor earlier this week announced about $700 million in cuts. And some people were like, good, we're tightening the belt. We're tightening the belt in the middle of a pandemic. And we're tightening the belt on people who already were in need of services, and drastic need of services. So that means that there are going to be furlough days for state employees. And it's like, well, how does that impact me on a day-to-day? Well, if you know someone who is receiving SNAP or food stamps, and they need assistance with like redetermination and making sure that they can feed their family, there may not be a DHS worker, Department of Human Service worker available to pick up the phone. That may mean that we lay off people at a state level, which means that we now need to pay unemployment to that person. It could mean if you have a child, if your relative is receiving assistance in childcare, that may mean that their childcare provider may not get paid. And so they may not have a childcare provider anymore if they have to go to work, or if they're, just all of that. If someone is, if they have a family member who is in a state-run institution, we don't know if that institution is going to be staying open and where that family member may be moved to. And so, like, I say that the budget is a moral document, and it says what we care about and where we put money. We say what we care about where we put money. And a lot of legislators are going to be afraid to take that vote right now on closing corporate loopholes, on taxing services, because if you go to get your hair cut, you're not getting taxed on that. If you, in the same way that someone who has a yacht, they are not taxed on yacht services, which is, yeah. And so with attempting to plug a lot of these holes, it's really going to be, we either do a flat tax, we either raise the flat tax on everyone, or we have to find unique ways in which to close up the budget. And legislators don't, like, despite what was said during, the fair tax campaign, legislators hate taking votes on raising taxes because they know that there's going to be a mailer saying that they voted to raise taxes. But if we don't raise taxes, we will be $8.1 billion in the hole, or continue to be we will get up to $16.2 billion in the hole by the end of this fiscal year, which ends on January 30th. And with $28.4 billion to play with. So we will be we will possibly have to cut half of our state budget. That's where we're at right now. That is hard to say, but it is the reality. And it means that on the ground, homeless youth service providers, what does it mean for their staff? What does it mean for their programming? What does it mean for a youth who has become attached to a service provider who is now going to be laid off? What does it mean for students who are in university and may not be able to get a Pell Grant anymore because we don't have the funds, and we may have to lay off staff in our university systems?
Thanks, Naya. That's definitely a lot to take in and consider. Ted, I'm wondering if you could follow up on that with like how the night ministry then is approaching things at the state level.
Yeah, so I think we are monitoring. We're fortunate in a way at the night ministry because we don't rely on the state for a large portion of our operating budget. Right, we have got really robust support from the community, and we have really diversified funding. So cuts in state funding tend to impact us less than it does organizations that are more heavily state funded. However, like Naya said, our clients are young people who access a lot of different services around the community. So what we saw in previous times when the budget was really unpredictable was, as a system, we had to figure out a patchwork of support, right? Because the safety net was getting frayed, and the safety net was, in some cases being torn apart during the last budget crisis. So really trying to figure out ways to kind of patch that up as a system was pretty difficult at times. So certainly we're keeping our eye on that. I think some of the things that I've been thinking about recently, and I've been in discussions about recently, though, are like thinking about how our system has pivoted to meet the needs presented by the pandemic. And so what's worked, and how can we keep what's worked going forward? I think I've heard a lot of talk recently about advances in telehealth as a system to provide medical care to our clients. And I think one of the great things that we've seen, especially in our street medicine program, which goes out to encampments and provides medical care in encampments where homeless people are living. I think the thing that I've seen there and that we've seen there is that as Medicaid restrictions have loosened around telehealth and billable opportunities for telehealth services, we've been able to provide create really rich partnerships with organizations like Mile Square Health Center to provide assessments so that folks who are using opioids can access medication-assisted treatment via telehealth. Additionally, we're starting to look at some telehealth services for psych medication management. Some of our psych services in our youth shelters have switched over to telehealth as well. And so having like a broad ability for telehealth services to be billable by Medicaid is really important or it has become really important for the clients that we serve. And so any efforts to keep that going, that's kind of a mix between state and federal, but it has a touch of both. Additionally, I would say something that we worked on with CCH last year, right before this started, was support for college students who are experiencing homelessness. Illinois does not have a huge, does not have like a uniform system of how universities and colleges provide support for students who are experiencing homelessness in college. and so that's something we started work on last year, but the pandemic kind of threw that into disarray, so we weren't able to get that through. But I think that's something that's still really important, especially as we think about like how the pandemic and online learning has kind of impacted young folks' ability to stay connected to school, whether it be, you know, elementary school, high school, even college or trade schools, right?
Thanks, Ted. Before I open it up for questions from folks, if Naya or Ted, you have anything else you kind of want to close with, or do we just want to see what questions folks have?
I do just want to reiterate something Naya said about the relationality of advocacy. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the work that I do is like the relationships that I built with staff, right? So whenever I work with young people doing advocacy work, they sort of get disappointed when they don't get to meet with the elected official, right? Like they don't get to meet Senator Duckworth, or they don't get to meet with Senator Durbin. And I would love for them to have an open door into Senator Durbin and Senator Duckworth's office, but I always tell them, it's sometimes that conversation you have with the person that answers the phone or the person that works for them is even more important than having the conversation with them, because like that person is going to go places and you want to get them informed so that not only can they share that with their boss, but they can share that with their colleagues, and they can share the information that they learn from you with people who they work for in the future, right? And you never know, like they could even become an elected official or a policymaker at some point in the future. So that relationality of our work really, I think, is a key to it for me, and what I try to stress to folks that are interested in advocacy.
I would definitely agree with that. And it's, people think even the legislative liaison or the person who is sitting at the front desk, like that person is going to get you in. I've had legislators sign on to my legislation because people say I'm personable, but I've been personable with their staff. And someone else may have gone in and said, the legislator said, we'll see. And then I come and I'm like, can she sign on to this? And they're like, let me just tell her, yeah. And then the person signs on as a chief co-sponsor, and it's like, thank you so much.
Yeah, and a lot of times that elected official has like 5 minutes for you, but their staff sometimes has like an hour, right? So I think the conversations are just richer when you can build that relationship with their staff. So
awesome. Thank you both so much. I want to open it up now to see if there are any questions you all have that Ted and Naya can answer.
There, I have a quick question. Naya, you had mentioned that there's multiple ways to lobby. You could have maybe a few individuals going and building a relationship with the staffer or the elected official, or you could have hundreds of people go down to rally for a cause. Do you feel that one method is kind of preferred over the other or more impactful, or do they both have, pros and cons?
I absolutely think that they both have pros and cons. If you want, so during the last budget crisis, which is so funny, last budget crisis, the Governor Rana refused to refused to sign the past budget. We brought, I think, upwards of like 3,000 people, and this is a coalition. We filled the Capitol with people. The governor could not walk from his office to the floor to give his budget address. That is impactful. That makes the news. That makes people understand what's going on. But also, like Ted, this is how, like, I had first started at the organization when this happened. We wanted to get a meeting. We wanted youth to meet the governor and say, this is why these programs are important. Wouldn't give us a meeting. So we ended up doing a sit-in at the governor's office at the Thompson Center, like buzzed in, we did some recognizance, got into the governor's office and did a sit-in until we got a meeting with his chief of staff. Got a meeting with his chief of staff, said we want to meet with the governor. Got in, like, I think it was going to take a couple of days, and we're like, we'll come back. We don't want to do another sit-in here. but we ended up getting an opportunity to have, I think, like 5 or 6 youth sit down with the governor.
Yep.
And what does that mean, not only for them, but the optics of like youth who are experiencing homelessness are sitting down with the governor. I think there's so much value in it being like 5 or 6 folks sitting down with the person, but I also think that it's important for them to know these 5 or 6 people aren't the only people who care. And there are like, if I'm coming here, I know 10 other people that I'm going to post about this on social media and get them engaged as well. But having so many people, you're not going to be able to do that relational building in that way, whereas like me sitting across from you and like each one of us is telling our story or why this is important to us, that definitely sticks with people. I think part of being a politician is like remembering like really small details about people, and so when you see them again, they are going to mention it to you, and like you're like, oh my god, they remember me. And though I think those moments are important, as well as those big get out folks and, you know, bringing the charter buses down to Springfield.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Any other questions?
I just want to reiterate, they are approachable. They are they are incredibly, some of them, you know, will push back on things that you're going to say and like have their talking points about the unions are the reason that we're in the situation that we're in right now. And it's like, no, well, I'm here to talk about this and like setting agendas and like going into meetings with agendas. If you are going to like host meetings with legislators and bring them into your community, everyone having a role in those small meetings, whether a relational question, saying like what, like talking about your organization or your group and why you all are like connected together, you know, having an ask and, you know, saying, you know, thank you so much for your time. It's, you know, they also appreciate that as well.
Yeah, I love a good pivot question in a conversation because, you know, inevitably somebody's going to bring up the pension to you if you're talking to a state legislator. And I'm not a pension expert and I make no claims to be a pension expert. So I say, look, my job is not to tell you how to to tell you how to allocate money to the pension and homeless services. My job is to tell you why you need to include homeless services in your plan, right? Or I just flat out say, like, I don't know enough about pensions to tell you how to spend pension money. If it's with the federal government, it usually comes in around military spending. And again, I'm like, I've never been in the military, so I don't know how to tell you how to spend money about the military, but I do work for an organization that provides services to homeless youth and adults, and I know how to talk about that. So,
and quiet as it's kept, they don't know about pensions either. They just points.
Right, exactly.
I've got a question. I'm afraid that I don't know who the new appointee for HUD is, and I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about what you.
Yeah, so it's Representative Fudge from Ohio. She had been considered as a potential nominee for the Secretary of Agriculture. And the thought behind that was that she has experience with the SNAP program, which is the food stamp program, as a lot of people know it. And so that the thought was that she would do really well with creating policies that distribute the agriculture. And traditionally, the Secretary of Agriculture comes from the farming and agriculture side of the equation. And so the thought was it would be interesting to switch it up and have somebody who can work more on the distribution side of things. But the administration has decided to go with Tom Vilsack, who's the former governor of Iowa, former agriculture secretary under President Obama. So Representative Fudge, as far as I know, does not have a lot of direct experience in housing, but she does have a long history of working with the federal government and on topics related to housing. So like I said, that's why it's great that we have career staff who stay on during these transition times and to carry through a lot of the work. And so a lot of it will just be at the start, will just be about kind of like figuring out what the what needs to be corrected over the last few years, right? And then same thing with the Health and Human Services. So the nominee for that position is the Attorney General of California, Attorney General Becerra, I believe his last name is. And so same thing, not a ton of experience with Health and Human Services, but a lot of experience with like healthcare legislation and implementing healthcare and things like that in that state. So and the funding that I spoke about. So we receive federal funding for housing through both HUD, Housing and Urban Development, but also that Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funding that I was speaking of, that actually comes from Health and Human Services. So it's a little bit of a difference. And that actually makes it challenging, right? Because when we talk to housing staffers at in the federal government, in our senators' offices, they're usually very familiar with housing, HUD housing, right? And Runaway and Homeless Youth Act housing is a little bit different. And so we always have to do a lot of education around that when we start these relationships.
Thanks. Anyone else?
I had a question. Sorry, my camera's not on. Not able to have it on right now. I don't know if Ted or you could speak at all to applying a lot of what a lot of you said in more of a hyper local level. So talking to our alder person or within our specific neighborhood or community. I know you both are focusing more on state legislation, but if you have any, just kind of thoughts to share on that strategy and advocacy.
I don't know, Teddy, if you want to take it, but
do you want to start? I mean, I was going to mention bring Chicago home.
So we've had so I work on our state team, but we do have a city team, and I think it is even more impactful as the constituency bases get smaller. I think advocacy and having interactions with that or with your older person gets even more important, and that they should be taking into account what the thoughts and the feelings of their community are, just because an older person can lose by 2 votes. That happens in the city of Chicago. But I would say that the same type of meetings and relationship building is the thing that you want to do. Most of the work of older folks is constituency services. And it's, sometimes it's my street hasn't been plowed. But it's also bigger issues of saying, this is how I want you to vote on the city budget. I think that this budget process or this budget cycle this year, it was the closest budgetary vote that we've had in Chicago history. And that came down to people doing grassroots organizing and calling their older person and saying, I want a city budget where, we give more money to housing and mental health services than to the carceral system. And we had older folks who were willing to step in and step out and say, I'm not going to vote with the mayor and I'm not going to vote on the status quo. There are a lot of great resources out there. I will say, and this is just plugging, I'm on the board for Chicago United for Equity. They worked on a people's budget project where they went out into communities throughout Chicago in the middle of a pandemic and asked people, and they did this money challenge where they said, okay, you have $100. How would you allocate this $100 in these, I think, 7 pots? And the pots were housing, mental health services, infrastructure, so roads and bridges, carceral system, and spread it across, and then compared it to what the city actually, the budget that the city put out, and said, these are the differences. This is what people of Chicago say that they want to spend their money on, and this is what the city is actually spending its money on, and saying, now take this to your older person and say, this is what we said in Rogers Park. This is what we said in Uptown. This is what we said in Lakeview. This is what we said in Inglewood. This is what we said in Bridgeport how we want to spend our money. And if you're not willing to step up and take a vote and say this budget doesn't reflect your community, we will remember you this next election. And we will continue to press upon you over the next, 2 years that this is not what we wanted and you voted against your community.
Yeah, I think I second all of that Naya just said. I would also say that the conversations that I have with alder people in Chicago tend to be very service-based conversations about the services that that our clients are receiving in their wards. It tends to be less. We do participate in sort of like campaigns. So like there are several campaigns that we've signed on to. One is Treatment, Not Trauma, which is trying to create a 211 system that would route mental health calls away from the police system and then create like an appropriate mental health response. Another one is Bring Chicago Home, which would create more funding for housing by increasing the real estate transfer tax. I think that the conversations that I have, though, as just an individual with older people are much more service-based, but they're also more value-based, right? So it's like, what are the values of our community? After we saw some new progressive alder people elected in a couple of years ago, there was much more of a desire to have those conversations, like, how are we seeing people experiencing homelessness as neighbors who have challenges versus like a drain on our system or a public nuisance? Like, how do I have those conversations with people in my neighborhood, and how can I respond without involving or without instituting a process that will result in like police getting called and tents being torn up and like people being uprooted from the spaces that they're choosing to live in, right? So I think a lot of the conversations I've had, especially in the last 2 years with our local officials, have been much more value-based, and like, how do we create a community that sees people experiencing homelessness as our neighbors, right?
Because they don't want not to be labeled as a progressive. And it's like, you've been on the council for 30 years and you are not anywhere near a progressive, but now everyone wants to be a progressive.
Yeah.
Until it's time to be a progressive.
Thank you. Anybody else? Questions?
I have a quick question. Y'all have done a great job of talking about what you've been doing, and I was just wondering, is there any like particularly pressing projects, initiatives, or efforts that you think that people in Chicago or we as service providers maybe should be paying attention to, or just, putting energy behind? Anything in particular?
I mean, this COVID things are coming into my email box as we are talking. This bill is changing and they are chipping away at protections for folks. I
feel like the thing right now is the stimulus plan in DC, right? I think that it's like Naya said, it's changing constantly. I mean, individual stimulus was not in there until just over the weekend. There's never been funding for agencies in there. I think the other thing is there's a group called Charge that's working at the city level. I think they're doing some really interesting work about like healthcare for homeless communities. And so that's something that I think folks can start to track. I can never remember the acronym because it's so long. It's Chicagoans. Naya, can you?
Yes, I Googled it. It's because Google is free 24/7. Chicago Homelessness and Health Response Group for Equity.
Yeah, and so this was a creation of initially a bunch of West Side providers at the start of the pandemic, and it's kind of expanded to kind of a citywide response, looking at how our communities are working. It's really they're doing some excellent work. So to follow that, it would be great right now because that's something that's going on as we speak.
I think another thing is as we are thinking about the vaccination plan, and
Oh,
just
yes.
sure that folks who are experiencing homelessness are at, like, because of congregate setting, because people live doubled up, and for folks who may not know what doubled up is, it's multiple households living in a single apartment or home, and one or more of the families are not on the lease and are technically experiencing homelessness, um, and they're more likely to contract COVID and work in settings that don't allow them to take time off with pay. So it's about education and getting the vaccine out to folks. Right now, I think no, not I don't think folks who are experiencing homelessness are currently in part of phase 2. And so just making sure that when the time comes, that folks who are experiencing homelessness are able to access the vaccine.
Yeah, I know we just have a couple minutes left, but on that point with the vaccine distribution, so I've been advocating for a vaccine plan that doesn't create like a priority based on worth, right? We don't want to say like people living in one group living situation are more worthy to receive the vaccine earlier than others. And so like essentially, if you think about how people live, anybody living in a group situation is at higher risk for contracting COVID and turning it into like kind of a super spreader event within that living situation. So whether you're living in a nursing home, whether you're living in a congregate living homeless shelter, whether you're living in a long-term care facility or a college dormitory or a military barracks, right? You should all have access to, if it's based on your living situation, then everybody should have access to it at the same time, so as we don't create that worthiness. Also, when it talks about essential workers in Illinois' plan, I think those are included a little later in stage 1. What are we calling an essential worker? Is it just a first responder? Or are we including, direct service workers in homeless shelters, direct service workers, in drop-in programs? Are we considering folks who, are working in other industries that haven't been able to close down because they're an essential industry? So just thinking of a broad definition for what essential worker means, right?
Great. Thank you so much, Ted and Naya, and for everyone for joining. You had really great questions. I'm sure both Ted and Naya would be open to chatting more, answering more questions if you have them. We are going to close up shop here. Ted and Naya, I don't know if you feel comfortable up there. Wow, so far ahead of me. I was going to ask them to drop their emails in the chat. Naya has also put a lot of great links in there for us with the things that we have chatted about. So please feel free to check those out. And if you are interested in joining with the night ministry and our advocacy and haven't kind of signed up yet, you can email Ted. His email is there, and just inquire about joining our advocacy team. But thank you all so much, and we hope to see you at our next LampLight lunch.
Thank you for putting this together. I really enjoyed myself.
Thanks everyone.
Naya.
Thank you.
Thanks, Naya.